Go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us again. We have a few new people that weren't at the first event, but this is, are you comfortable dealing with reasonable suspicion? And instead of doing a full recap for you, since I did send out the recording, for those of you who are joining this time who didn't join last time, there is a recording that I'm happy to send. So if you didn't get it, please reach out to me and I can share that with you. But just real quickly, we have Pamela Mack, who is president and owner of AccuScreen, and we're a pre-employment screening company based in the Northwest, but providing services nationally. And we have Heidi Mason of Innova Legal Advisors, who is our favorite attorney and who is here to give her, legal but not legal, right, perspective on how to handle this situation. And last time we talked about, what is reasonable suspicion, best practices on how to handle it. There, ideally being two people, whether that's two managers or manager in HR, how to be direct and succinct. And then Heidi was kind enough to provide us with a checklist that you guys are more than willing or more than able to use in your businesses to help you sort of identify and go through the process so that you can feel confident when you do make the decision. So today we're really going to kind of pick up from where we left off, but go back a little bit. We realized after we put this together that we probably should have talked about the policy first, but I know the meat of it is, what do I do, right? What do I do when I'm in the throes? So we're going to step back just a little bit and talk about best practice of, what should be included in a drug-free workplace policy and how that affects the decision that you make going forward. So Heidi, I will throw that to you first.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. It's so nice to see everybody here and some familiar faces from last week. I always love to see that because that means you didn't get tired of me last time. So welcome back. For those who are new, it's so great that you're joining us in this session. My general legal disclaimer that I gave last time that I'll give again: I am an attorney. I am not your attorney. I can't give you specific legal advice, but I can absolutely talk about the legal issues generally, give you my take on different situations. And if you have a question about the topic, I can totally field hypothetical situations. So the best way to ask that question in the chat or just unmuting, say, hey, hypothetically, if this kind of situation happened, what's your take on that? And if it's based on a real life situation, it's helpful to change the facts a little bit to protect the innocent. That would be nice. Let's go ahead and go forward. So on policies, right? What is a drug-free workplace policy? What should go in it? There are a lot of different factors. So just straight up, what is it? It is something that you have in writing that talks about your company's stance on drugs and potentially alcohol in the workplace. Right? That's all the policy is. It ought to go in your employee handbook if you have one. If you don't have one, you can have a standalone written policy. But that written document helps you and management and employees all get on the same page about what the company's take is on employees' use and possession and manufacture and other things related to drugs and alcohol. Is there a one size fits all for drug and alcohol policies? No, absolutely not, because you have a mix of industries that are regulated that require you to have certain things in your policies and industries that are not. And then you add in the owner's perspective or the board's perspective on what should and shouldn't be happening in that organization. So generally speaking, your substance abuse policy or drug and alcohol policy should be unique to match your culture, right? That's kind of number one. If you are in a highly regulated industry that requires certain things to be in there, then yes, you need to include those in, right? If you're a DOT regulated employer, if you have federal contracts and subcontracts that require you to have certain things in your drug and alcohol policy, you need to check with counsel and make sure all those points are there. If you're a private organization, you're not regulated, you don't have these mandates, then it's really up to you. And what you're managing are things like risk, right? if I'm really light on how I treat drug and alcohol use in my workplace, what could I potentially be exposed to in terms of risks? Like a suit from a third party who is injured because my employee was high when they were driving the vehicle, right? Um, if if you operate in an environment where there are a lot of physical hazards, right? Higher workers' comp exposures if there's a safety issue going on. On the other side of the fence, though, from an HR standpoint, you have recruitment and selection difficulties to kind of think about too. With so many states legalizing marijuana specifically, more and more people use marijuana. And it gets harder and harder to hire and retain good employees who decide, you know what, this is the choice I want to make for my own lifestyle, and I'm not going to change it. And if my employer takes a hard stance against it, peace out, I'm gone, I can find another job. That gets really tough. So, as a company, you have to make some really difficult judgment calls. You add in the law and everything first as the baseline, but then it's up to you to make those judgment calls. How are you going to balance those needs of the business, the risks, the HR side of things, and then if you're a privately held company, the values of your leadership, right? Some companies care a lot. Some CEOs care a lot, and they have very specific, intense feelings about whether marijuana is a gateway drug or if it's not. And those are part of the company culture. And trying to weave all those things together, like that's the fun of doing what we do.
I was going to add, or actually ask you, and then maybe kind of add in a little bit about this. I noticed that some policies are very specific about here's exactly what we test for, here's how we test for it, here's sometimes even the cutoff levels, and others keep it more general, like we are allowed to do drug testing if we have a suspicion. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say one is better than the other. They each have a purpose, right? So the purpose of going really specific is either because the company wants to be extremely transparent with its employees about exactly how it feels. And they really don't want their managers to have much discretion in this area to make decisions. So they'll get right down to the details of levels so that everybody's on the same page and it's easy to administer, and you have a concrete result every single time. There's no judgment call there. On the flip side, those vague policies, right? This is, well, we generally feel this way about it. And if you have a positive test, then we could take disciplinary action up to and including termination. But it's really not specific at all about whether any of that is going to happen. Those are generally written because the company doesn't want to say upfront what it's going to do every single time. Now, it might behind the scenes have a rubric and just not want to share that publicly with all of the employees. It's just a decision on the company's side not to be fully transparent with that information, sometimes because they have a fear that if they were that transparent, employees might game the system, and they really don't want that. They don't want people trying to get like right up to the line and then inadvertently crossing it. So it comes down to preference. How much leeway do you want to give yourself when you're that transparent?
And I do think the other reason sometimes they're more open is to allow for the opportunity to change maybe your process without having to change the whole handbook, or to bring in something. For example, somebody has a kidney problem and can't do a urine test, and you decide to do a different type of testing. Or you just decide, hey, we want to switch from urine to oral fluids for this purpose, or we're going to do some of our people in this way because they're local and some in another way. It gives you some opportunity. If you make it too, in those cases, if you make it too, specific, you might not have the ability to then go ahead and make a change when you need to. But I do agree that often the policy says the more broad, and then the internal protocols might be a lot more specific.
Well, we talked a lot about this too, sort of behind the scenes, and something that has come up recently. And I don't know how many of you have work from home folks right now. Obviously, reasonable suspicion when you're working on site and there is a safety issue. And making the decision can be a little easier. But I had someone recently mention to me that, he works from home, he lives in an apartment, his neighbor is working from home, and he literally has the smell of marijuana wafting through his vent in his bathroom all day long, every day, right? So how does this affect, drug-free workplace policies or just policies in general? And how do you then identify? Seems like it makes it a lot harder. But I guess the question is it a safety issue or is it a performance issue at that point?
Oh, very interesting. Okay, so on the first part with the policy, thankfully most policies are written to include anytime the employee is performing work, regardless if they're actually on site. If the policy isn't already written that way, that's a nice change to make, because you want to cover all activities that the employee engages in while they're representing you as an organization, right? Now, in terms of, well, if they're working from home, is this like a safety issue or a performance issue? I mean, it can be both, depending on what they're doing. If they're an office worker, it's less likely to be a safety issue, but that doesn't mean it's not, right? You can trip down the stairs in your own home. Whether or not that's going to be a workers' comp claim is topic for a different discussion. But most likely it's a performance related issue. You've got somebody who is doing work when they are impaired, and that's against almost every policy I've seen. I wouldn't say every single policy, but most policies. What about reasonable suspicion? In that kind of situation, are you as the employer always going to know if that's what's happening with your remote workforce? No. But even if they're in person working on your site, you're not always going to know either, right? You're kind of counting on other people to come forward and make that report or some sort of visual observation. And in this case, if it was a neighbor and the neighbor decided they were going to intrude and call that person's employer, right? If I receive that report from somebody's neighbor, they give me their address, they tell me exactly what it is. I confirm that the address is in fact right next door to my employee, and I go out there and I smell it. Yes, I'm taking that employee. That's reasonable grounds at that point.
Wow, interesting. Okay. We talked a little last time also about, what not to do, right? So we talked about, can you take the keys from the employee if they are very, visibly impaired? Should you call the police if they do get in their car to drive, right? That's certainly not best practice. Don't tackle them, right? As they're jumping over the fence to try to get away. We had that whole conversation. How about just really quickly, again, going over, best practice on how to handle that. If you do or you don't have HR, and when that leads up, I guess, to that final decision of, okay, yes, we have reasonable suspicion, and then we'll kind of talk through what happens next.
Sure. So if we're talking about an employee who doesn't want to cooperate and they don't want to get tested, and so they deny the test, which, that happens from time to time, and your policy ought to say something like, look, if you refuse the test, we're going to treat that as a policy violation, right? And we'll move straight over into disciplinary action. But if you have this moral obligation that you're sensing that, like, I can't let this person that I believe is impaired get into their car, like I can't live with myself if I don't do something, I want to do something. What are the boundaries there, right? Don't take their stuff, right? Don't steal from them, right? It's their personal stuff. Don't take it, and don't touch them, right? If they don't want to be touched. Now we're talking about an assault battery kind of situation. And don't box them into a location or stop them from moving, because that opens the door to like a false imprisonment kind of a claim, because you're not law enforcement. You don't have the right to do that. What you can do is make an emotional appeal. You can talk to the employee. Now, they may or may not listen to you, but you can do your best to convince them using your words not to get into that vehicle, right? And you can also tell them that, look, this issue aside, you're refusing to test aside, I still care about your safety and other people's safety. Will you please at least sit here and sober up before you go home? Can I provide a safe environment for you to stay here so that you're safe? Can I call a taxi for you? Can I call an Uber for you? Can I get somebody else to take you home and then make arrangements for us to get your car back to your place? But please, please, for your own safety and everybody else's safety, please don't drive. That you can do.
Great, great. Okay, so let's say at this point we've decided we do have reasonable suspicion. What are the options from here? So with regard to testing.
So I will take that. So there's basically 4 types of specimens that you would use for a drug test. The first is going to be blood, and that's very uncommon, as you can imagine, in employment screening. Somehow we don't like to be that intrusive with our employees. It's the best, but it's just kind of off the table, except for cases where maybe there was a car accident, someone was injured, and they're in the hospital, that sort of thing. Then a blood test will happen often. Um, Hair follicle testing is not allowed in Oregon, and it's also not appropriate for reasonable suspicion because it's going to show you everything from 7 days back to 90 days that the applicant or the candidate or the employee has used. So that's kind of off the table as well. So basically we have urine testing and oral fluids testing. We're going to send you after this a detection window chart that's going to show you kind of the different types of specimens and how long substances will stay in the employee's system. So for urine, you got to remember that it's a waste product. So what you're going to get from urine is what happened a few hours ago, probably up until a couple days ago for most things. And for THC, up to a couple weeks. Everyone knows 30 days. 30 days is super, super rare. So it's more like a few days to a couple weeks, possibly longer than that. An oral fluids test is going to show you more like a blood test. So it's going to have a detection window from a few minutes ago until maybe a day and a half, maybe a couple days at most. And even for marijuana, it's actually shorter. It's more like 12 hours, 12 to 24 max hours. So oral fluids is actually very good option for a reasonable suspicion test. And you're going to take that, actually collect it on site. So that's also kind of nice too. You don't have to take the applicant or the candidate employee into the car. I guess you don't have reasonable suspicion candidates usually. So I'll try to remember to say employee. You're going to take the employee and you don't have to worry about taking them to the car. You don't have to worry about finding a collection site. If it's off hours or middle of the night, that sort of thing, you don't have to worry about collection sites. So oral fluids is a pretty good option for that. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it is a test that they literally take the swab, put it in their mouth for a couple of minutes. It goes through a chain of custody process in the sense that you're going to fill out all the forms, you're going to seal it, you're going to send it to the laboratory. I want to make sure to be clear that I don't recommend an instant oral fluid test for reasonable suspicion. And the reason for that is that it really is not very good at collecting THC at all. So even though a lot of companies don't want to test for THC in maybe a pre-employment situation, for a suspicion situation, you typically would want to keep that on your panel. I do have some employees now, or employers now, who take THC off their pre-employment panels. Then they put it back on for the post-accident or suspicion, because if you are worried about someone being under the influence, obviously that's one of the reasons they could be. So urine is still a very acceptable test and accepted for reasonable suspicion. And it's not bad, but it's not going to give you quite as clear of a look into what's currently going on in that employee's system as a saliva test would. On the other hand, with the saliva or the oral fluids test, you have to have a manager or somebody that's trustworthy, that HR person, someone who can administrate that test. The only way at this point you can really adulterate or fake a saliva test is by giving it to someone else. So if you don't have those managers or HR people that you can train to take that test and are there and available to do that, then the oral fluids test is not going to work, and you're definitely going to want to send your employee off to a collection site for a urine test. There's also breath alcohol test. That would be the best way to test for alcohol. So if you are sending them to a collection site for a urine test, and if you do really suspect it is alcohol, you can smell it, that sort of thing, I would recommend a breath alcohol test. And that would happen at a clinic or an urgent care clinic or some occupational clinic, something like that.
Yeah. So talk to us about turnaround times.
So urine and oral fluids have the same turnaround times if you're not using anything instant, because they go off to the same exact laboratories and they go through the same exact process. So you're usually going to get results about 24 hours from the receipt at the lab. So if you were to take the test on Monday, it usually is going to get to the lab on Tuesday. And most often we do get those negative results that day, sometimes the next day, because they do say 24 hours from receipt. If it's not negative, if it's anything but negative, it goes through a confirmation process. It's going to take another 24 up to 72 hours, depending on how many non-negative substances there may have been. And so you're going to take an extra couple of days, whether it's urine or oral fluid, it's going to be the same exact process.
Great. So Shauna had a question. From a compliance standpoint, are there regulations about making sure supervisors and managers are officially trained to do oral fluids collections?
So they don't actually, no one actually comes and makes sure that you've been trained well. However, on the other side of it, if it comes through to the laboratory and anything's incorrect on the chain of custody form, on the seal, you have to seal it, have the applicant initial it, pack it up a certain way with the chain of custody form. There's signatures in various spots. If it gets to the laboratory and anything in chain of custody has been broken, they're not going to run that test. So there's no compliance that's, watching it on the training side, but there is compliance on the other side. And the laboratory simply will just not run the test if it doesn't look like everything went perfectly.
Yeah. Okay, great. The other thing about oral fluids testing that makes it relatively easy is that you can order supplies and have them on hand, but you don't pay for anything until you actually ship it off to the lab. Why don't you talk about what that process looks like, Pam?
Yeah, so we set up in our case, we set up the laboratory and the oral fluids testing process. We order the test kits for you. The test kits stay on site. And then when you need that kit, it's there, it's ready for you to go. We do the training, so you're trained and ready to go. There's lots of resources to retrain if necessary. And then you ship it off via FedEx. So it's pretty simple.
Yeah, totally. And being on the other side of that, when I started with OcuScreen, I went through the process, and it's, it was easy. Again, it's just sitting and waiting to have for the swab to get saturated enough that it is accurate. And I will also tell you from a previous experience, I worked for a company that did pre-employment urine testing, and they did it on site. And to have someone sitting in the restroom with you, like waiting for you, it's very uncomfortable. And I know it's different, certainly in a reasonable suspicion situation, but I think just the invasiveness and just it's an easier process. Nobody wants to deal with urine anyway, right? Like, so oral fluids, and you hand the swab to the candidate, and they can put it in their mouth and then stick it into the tube. So much easier process. Question: should employers have a procedure manual with their process?
Nice, I'll take that one. I'm a fan of procedure manuals, right? That helps all of the people who are administering the tests get on the same page and do it the right way and have the resources and training. Is it a violation for you to not have it? No, but it's definitely a best practice to have it. And a quick note about on-site collection. I don't think we talked about this last time, but if it's a reasonable grounds test, and you're doing this collection on site in the middle of this person's shift, don't let them go back to work, right? Not until that you get those results back. So if it is really truly in the middle of somebody's shift, then you make arrangements for that person to go home, and they don't work again until you get the results back.
Very good point. Or don't let them drive home in the same way as in the other situation that we talked about. So I shouldn't say don't let them, but use your emotional appeal to make sure that they don't drive home, as Heidi said earlier.
Absolutely. Great. Well, that's all the questions I have. Do we have any last minute lingering questions that you guys would like to ask?
I have one for Pam. So I've heard this as an excuse that has been given before, and I don't know how common it is. You might have more insight than I do. How often is it for an employee or a candidate to say that the reason why their THC test came out positive is because they use a CBD cream or something, a topical cream for pain?
I knew you were going to say that. As soon as you said you had a question, I should have brought that up. That's a really good point. It comes up every single day almost, that somebody says they either took internally or used some kind of a CBD product. So here's the deal with CBD and THC. First of all, the drug test is not testing for CBD. So if it's truly a CBD product, that's not one of the panels that's being tested for. So it's impossible to get a CBD positive. Let's just say it that way. However, some CBD products contain THC. So is it possible to get a positive THC test when you're using CBD? I would say from using a cream or a lotion, no. I haven't heard of that happening at all. There's just not enough, and it's not getting in your system enough. If you're taking an oral CBD, and because that industry is non-regulated, it could have THC in it, and who knows how much. So if it has enough, could it trigger a positive test? Sure. Are you then also under the influence of THC? Yes. So if you have enough THC in your system to trigger that positive THC test, wherever it came from, I mean, I'm not an attorney, but I mean, you're still getting a positive THC test from the CBD. If that's the case and someone's taking some kind of a CBD internally and they're testing positive for their marijuana test, probably should find a different product, because they may be getting more THC than they think. Does that make
Good.
sense?
Yep, absolutely. Anything else? If not, thank you very much for attending. We're right before noon, and we will again, we'll be sending out the form that Pam mentioned that shows the various types of testing and the thresholds and all of that piece for you guys. And then we are recording this, so that will go out in a few days as well. So in the meantime, if you guys have questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.